Hi, guys. Welcome to Module 4. In the interest of our work, I just shared with you in our last Zoom meeting in Module 3 that I was going to reduce some of our work load, at least in lecture and in some of the reading. So this week, we're just going to focus on Jeremiah. So definitely make sure you do the readings as assigned for Ezekiel in your textbook, but you can review the primary source of that if you wish in your textbook and in your Bibles. But we're going to focus primarily on Jeremiah this week in terms of our content portion. So to that end, we're going to get started here looking at Jeremiah, who, by the way, is one of my favorite prophetic materials to work with. It's just beautiful. And if you are a fan of great writing, Jeremiah certainly will fit the bill. So I do hope you enjoy your reading of Jeremiah, the prophet of the Babylonian exile, as much as I do. But as we do with everything, let's get started with a little bit of background. So uh, Jeremiah lives at the time. Remember, Jeremiah is one of three prophets that is there as Babylonia is kind of coming into its power, and he's there for the destruction of Judah. So he'll witness the fall of Jerusalem at the hands of the Babylonians in 586 BCE. So he's a really important prophet for understanding how Hebrew identity is being shaped when you have the final fall of not just, a culture and a nation. Remember that the sovereignty of Israel is a huge piece of their identity, especially in terms of how they understand their unique relationship with God. But the destruction of the temple, this is the first time that the temple will fall. And that's a really defining moment for the Hebrews. The temple represents the center and heart of ritual practice and worship. It represents, just in its physical occupation in Jerusalem, right, as a symbol. There's so many aspects as a symbol to Hebrew identity. Remember that too, that the temple was, begins or has sort of its beginnings or origins in the Davidic covenant. Now it will be Solomon that carries through with that, which is going to lead to its own issues within Israel. But so much history, so much religious culture are wrapped around that major symbol, and it's leveled. So that's a really big moment, and Jeremiah's witness to this and his understanding of these events and how it figures into what it means to be a Hebrew. How do we live? Are the covenants real? All of those things are present. So just a little background that you get: he's born to a priestly family in Anatoth, and he begins prophesying when he's a fairly young boy. He's a contemporary of King Josiah, and he outlives him. He ends up being part of the lamentation. He witnesses the exile. Remember, too, that when the Babylonians will conquer Judah, they will take a significant portion of the population, distribute them throughout the Babylonian Empire, and those Hebrews that are part of that first diaspora event become part of a generation, 50 years, that live in exile, and some of them will not come back. Just fast forwarding, remember, it'll be Cyrus of Persia who will liberate those Hebrews who are in exile when they defeat the Babylonian Empire. And some of the Hebrews will choose not to go back, and some will elect to go back. The welcome they receive is not consistent. There is some celebration, but mostly there's a lot of criticism and rejection and a sense of abandonment for those Hebrews who feel that they were left to kind of maintain things in a way that the Hebrews who were returning from exile And the reasons some people don't come back are varied. They are everything that you would expect in that kind of situation. You have people that are born out into an area, they're born while in exile, they grow up, and everything they know is their new home. And they get married, they have families and jobs of their own. Some of them join the military, all the things that are normal human things that give people reasons. Religious reasons do compel some folks to go back, certainly familial reasons as well. And also remember that Cyrus not only liberates the Hebrews, but he also allows them to begin to rebuild the temple. So there's a lot of things going on there, and Jeremiah is on the front end of that. So we start to see some really important pieces of what that exile might mean, and how that unfolds comes from later material, but this is a really important piece. One thing also to remember, that when you're reading through Jeremiah, if you feel like sometimes things are kind of flipping, like the way the narrative is put together, well, one of the reasons you kind of get that feeling is that the book itself is a collection of a lot of different types of writing. And it has some kind of rough chronology, but I would pretty much say that it's not a very clear, definite chronology or a set of organization. So that's our background for this. So we'll move into the next piece. The content is pretty straightforward. The book of Jeremiah contains 3 types of materials, and most of those are ones that you're familiar with: prophetic oracles, biographical narratives, and editorial notes. Now, going back to your work that we began with prophetic material, you'll see that Jeremiah really tends to follow that structure that we've become incredibly familiar with. We get the call of Jeremiah, we get the oracles against the nations, the oracles of doom, we get the restoration of hope, we get all of those things that we're pretty familiar with, all of that piece of the structure. And you may have also noticed some really cool stuff, especially since we just finished up Hosea, that really early in Jeremiah's book, he uses some really familiar metaphors, especially the one of marriage and divorce. And it sets up the problem in the relationship between Yahweh and Israel, as it's interpreting the events that are happening. And they use that metaphor of marriage and divorce again, charging infidelity, particularly here, the desire of Israel to worship other gods, particularly the Baals, seem to show up quite a bit as a kind of infidelity. But the infidelity also expands to how the role of the king. Now, I told you a long time ago, what seems to be a galaxy far, far away, that when we started this king thing, it would just keep coming up. It's going to evolve and take on different aspects or pieces. But the king question always seems to kind of show up. And the role of the king in making treaties and alliances, in this case, the alliances with Egypt and Assyria, which seem to come under fire quite a bit, are also questioned by Jeremiah as a lack of fidelity to God. And so the metaphor that, like we saw with Hosea, and the charge of infidelity, both in the marital sense, but using that marital sense as a way to talk about the covenantal promises that I think it's in Jeremiah 3, where there's the invocation or the origin, actually, I'm sorry, Jeremiah 2, where the origin of Israel being brought out of the wilderness really should invoke in you Genesis, the Torah, really, those covenantal promises of the Torah that we got in Deuteronomy, even maybe a little hints of some of that Exodus language out of the wilderness, right? That we see these promises, and that as the bride of Yahweh, Israel has once more been unfaithful. And the events that are unfolding, that Jeremiah is present to, he's explaining as this is God, right, or setting aside Israel, divorcing and separating himself from Israel because of her infidelity. So moving along in that, the basic outline then can be broken into these sort of parts that I've got here for you. Chapters 1 through 25, this is where we get the intro and we get the account of Jeremiah's call. So if you're paying attention to your prophetic literature structure, you can really break this down for yourself here. We get those poetic oracles, and this is also where we kind of start coalescing some of the biographical information. We get 26 through 29. These are the conflicts with other prophets and authority figures that Jeremiah has. Then 30 through 33, we get the hope and consolation messages. 34 through 45, we get those stories of the time during and after the Babylonian structure. Definitely take time to read through those. That will be very helpful, especially in filling out some of the things that Collins is talking to you about in your textbook, which I think it starts on pages 354 going forward. I would really slow down and make sure you read carefully pages 354 through, I think it's 359, 360. And that's going to walk you through those. And then when you read through 34 and 45 carefully in the book of Jeremiah, it really will help you quite a bit. And then in 46 through 51, you get the oracles against the nations. 52 is the historical appendix, and your textbook will talk a lot about that as well. But what today I want to focus on with you is probably one of the most famous passages in prophetic literature and in the Hebrew scriptures themselves, which is the Temple Sermon. There are two accounts of the Temple Sermon in Jeremiah, in chapter 7, which is what we're going to look at here in a second, and in chapter 26. But I want to break down just in summary for you what's going on, and then I'm going to ask you to read the chapter 7 version and really just kind of go through that. So just a breakdown. For Jeremiah, he understands that the destruction of Israel by the Babylonians comes because, frankly, the Israelites broke their covenantal promise. I mean, those are the words of the covenant, I think it's in quotation is what he used. And for Jeremiah, the covenant is the core of all Hebrew identity. I think here in the slide I say it's the very reason for being. That relationship. Now, remember back in the day when we talked about how the universe or the cosmology of the Hebrew world is conceived, and it's a relational model, very different than some of the other ancient Near Eastern traditions that we looked at in those early days of our class. And here you see Jeremiah pulling on that thread, and it's so presumptive. It's in scholarly terms, we say it's in the air. At this point, you don't even have to know the books of the Torah. You don't have to even know the ideological narratives of the Hebrew scriptures to know that for the Hebrew conception, what it means to be Hebrew is deeply anchored in that relationship with Yahweh and the relationship to the created world and the relationship or the kind of person you're supposed to be with one another. And here Jeremiah's primary accusation is that Israel has violated its very core or sense of being. In its infidelity to Yahweh, it's violated that very sense of being. So he goes into denouncing Israel's leaders, particularly the kings and some of the other authority figures like other prophets. And he, in fact, he comes out and just calls some of these other prophets liars. He has a couple negative statements about some priests that he finds questionable in terms of their behavior as well. But the person that comes under a particular fire is King Joachim, who is Josiah's son. And that's because Joachim has engaged in making of treaties. So one of the things I said, earlier I said, you may be getting some strong Hosea vibes. You're probably also getting some strong Micah vibes in two ways. One, those charges are anchored in some social injustice that Jeremiah thinks is some of the cause and problems for why the situation is happening. The other thing that is happening here is that Jeremiah, unlike Micah, doesn't buy into the inviolability of Zion. Now, one of the things you may have gotten from the Isaiah piece is that Isaiah does buy into the inviolability of Zion. In fact, it's a core principle of the Isaiah prophecy. And he promotes it in that piece. In fact, that's part of those of you that were reading through the Isaiah material. And just to make sure you remember what the, I'll pause here, to make sure you understand what the inviolability of Zion is, just really simply, this is incredibly generalized, but it's this idea that God will protect the city of Jerusalem and the temple no matter what happens, right? That there's no way it can fall. So Jeremiah, Micah, don't buy that. Isaiah, that's a core principle of its prophecy. So in any case, if you're reading through this and you're like, wow, there's some similarities from another prophet, you're right. You're dead on. Micah and Jeremiah share that. And as I shared with you already, Jeremiah explicitly links the practices of injustice, which we saw with Micah, and the disparity between the members of the Hebrew community and the oppression of some of the Hebrews by their brethren, and the treatment and actions. So, one of the things I want you to see in that social injustice piece is that there's definitely a characteristic of systemic injustice, meaning that when a core principle is broken, then, and you see this, remember too, we talked about this with the fall, that it has a systemic effect. There is no one group or one area of the created world who is not affected by it. So if once a core relationship, and in this case, it's the relationship of the Hebrews to the Israelites, is ruptured, then that rupture ripples out. It ripples out in terms of the social structure and fabric. So the relationship of the Hebrews to one another and to other fellow human beings. So you have people who are oppressing fellow Hebrews, robbing them of land. Remember that we saw in Micah, there's this sort of false practices that are happening in terms of ritual, that they think, oh, since I offer sacrifice, that I don't have to care for the widow. I don't have to, the accusations of cheating people out of their rightful wages or what their money that is owed for goods or anything like that, or even how one treats the stranger, one who is a non-Hebrew. There are lots of expectations for that as well. You see all that rippling out, and Jeremiah is following the precedent that has been set by the other prophets, but he's deepening that because he's connecting it and saying, look, the result of that broken relationship and all those broken relationships is the final fall of Jerusalem. This was coming. And all along the way, we had chances to fix this, but collectively we chose not to. So nothing for Jeremiah is safe from harm. Nothing. That's a lot different tone than you have in Isaiah. And Jeremiah is even clear, as certainly as he witnesses the event, that the temple, most of all, that this sacred symbol is as vulnerable as anything if Israel doesn't change its ways. And in fact, one of the most famous moments in Jeremiah is when he talks about Israel's imminent doom, and this is called the Temple Sermon. So I want to switch to that with you. We're going to read one version of it. If you will just pause for a moment, hit pause on the lecture. And if you are coming back, let's look at chapter 7, verses 3 through 11. So I'm going to read this out so you can follow along. And then as I'm reading this to you, I want you to, whatever little scratch pad or notes that you have, write down what you think the primary charge is that Jeremiah is launching against the people. What does he say is the problem? There may be actual multiple problems, but see if you can figure it out as we read along. So starting in verse 1, this is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Stand at the gate of the Lord's house and there proclaim this message. Hear the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah who come through these gates to worship the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Reform your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this place. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave your ancestors forever and ever. But look, you are trusting in the deceptive words that are worthless. Will you steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal, and follow other gods you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house, which bears my name, and say, we are safe, safe to do all these detestable things? Has this house, which bears my name, become a den of robbers to you? But I have been watching, declares the Lord. Okay, so things get pretty intense. So think about right there in those verses 3 through 11, what are the charges? And what do those charges remind you of? How would you clean that up? And if you could, in a sentence or two, describe what's happening there with Jeremiah. So that's a really important task, I would say, you want to take the time to do. So kind of finishing up here, like his predecessors, Jeremiah has a pretty strong political message that's intertwined with a spiritual one. And that political message is quit selling out Israel, trust Yahweh. So he's very skeptical of all these alliances and treaties with foreign powers. It's a criticism of the king in that same light of, true power comes from God. Our actions, including our policies, should reflect that trust in God. He also cites that the nation's attempts to enter, as I shared here, these alliances are going to be part of the downfall. So that's the political piece. The spiritual piece, if you go back to that temple sermon that we just looked at in chapter 7, what do those practices or ethical mandates remind you of? Where's that coming from? How would you think about those? And then I would encourage you to take a look at chapters 27 and 28, because that's a really great story there. Just one more time, you can see almost cyclically how Jeremiah kind of returns to this. And you have this incredible image here where he parades about Jerusalem in this wooden yoke. And then he decides that that's not quite getting the message across, that if Israel doesn't change its ways, it's going to become a slave. It's not going to be able to govern its own self anymore. It's going to lose its sovereignty. So he doesn't think the wooden yoke is having quite the effect. So he takes on an iron one just to really make his point, as part of his demonstration of the slavery that is to come. And in fact, he'll announce there, I herewith deliver all these lands to my servant, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. So he just, in that message, says that Israel is being given away. But note here, he is saying my servant. And that's a really important piece too, that Yahweh is using the king of a foreign nation to execute his will, identifying King Nebuchadnezzar as his servant. So it'd be really important to think about that and pay attention to those kind of details as well. All right, this is where we're going to end our lecture for this week's material. I will see you at our Zoom meeting at 8:45 this Thursday. So please make sure you're there. I'm happy to answer any questions. Just one video this week, one lecture this week. I know that I've heard all your emails. I've been trying to check in with every person. And I know that there's a lot happening for people, and some folks are feeling kind of overwhelmed. So we're just going to make sure that you get a little bit of everything. This would be the Babylonian piece. We will not be covering Ezekiel, which would have been the post-exilic material that we would looked at. Next week, I am going to do Ruth and Esther for you. And then I will also next week talk to you a little bit about how the final exam is going to be set up. And I'll talk about dates. And again, just so you know, there's no proctoring or anything that you have to do. Everything on that exam can be completed at home. It'll be very much like a take-home exam, and you'll have 2 or 3 days to complete it. The deadline will have to stay firm just only because of when my grades are due, especially for some of my upperclassmen in the course. And if you have any questions at all, feel free to email me. And again, I'll see you very soon on the internet at our Zoom meeting. So take care. Take care of yourself, take care of your loved ones, and take care of your neighbors.